Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Fundamentals of Programming. Today we're going to be talking about for loops. So if you haven't watched the previous video on while loops, I highly recommend that you go back and do that because it will be very useful because for loops are just a special type of while loop. Now let's go ahead and look at what a while loop is. Now a while loop is just a type of iterative loop where the number of iterations, and if you don't remember what I say when I say iterations, that's just the times a code block runs. And that is going to be predetermined by the for loop statement. So just to repeat that, a for loop is going to repeat a code block a predetermined amount of times or a number of iterations. So this is again going to be a specialized form of a while loop, and here's a little graphic showing you that this loop is going to happen X times. Now, usually we define the number of times the code block is going to run by the range function. Now, the range function is actually pretty straightforward, and so I'm going to go ahead and explain what the range function is. Now, the range function isn't about, the wide open country range or the Range Rover. It's about ranges of numbers, which is a little less exciting, but very powerful nonetheless. So the range function generates a list of numbers based on the integer inputs given. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I mean by that. So with this first one, this is called one argument here, so range stop. So stop is going to be the integer that ends the range, but is not included. And this range is always going to start at 0. So if I were to say range 5, let me go ahead and grab a pen here, it would go, so it'd start at 0, so I'll say start, and it would go all the way up to, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is 4. Now remember, I said stop is not included, so it's going to stop on 4 and not include anything past that. So it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be our range, which is kind of cool. So now there's also another type where it's range start stop. So we could actually define where it starts. Now I could do that if I said range 1, 4, it wouldn't start on 0, it would start on 1. So now I'm going to go from here to here, right? So now I got from 1 to 4. That's pretty powerful. And then the last way that we can use the range function is we can define 3 attributes of our list of numbers. That would be the start, the stop, and the step. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this really quick. And let's do where I would do start, stop, step. So let's go ahead and say that I had, let's say I had my start was, I don't know, let's say 2, and that's so start, and let's say stop was 9, and let's say my step was 2 also. So we're going to start at 2 here. And we're going to go to not including 9, so that would go up to 8. Now, we're not going to, with this step, we're not going to count 3. So we'll skip 3, right? We're going to jump by 2 and go to 4. And we'll skip 5 and go to 6. And then we'll skip 7 and go to 8. So we would get, the result would be, the result would be 2, 4, 6, 8, right? Because I started at 2, so this would be if I did range 2, 9, 2. I'm going to get 2. I'm going to start at 2, going to go up until 9, but not including 9, so I'd stop at 8. So that right there, start at 2, and then I'm going to jump by 2 between each number. So I'm going to go 2, 4, 6, 8. And this could be, this step right here could be any number that we want. We could have done 10, and then I would only get 2 in this case because I can't go beyond that. But this is actually really powerful. And we'll look at some more examples here in just a second. But that's the range function. We use this to define the number of iterations because we can define our iterator this way. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I mean by an iterator. Okay, so let's go ahead and make ourselves a for loop here. Now, the first thing we need is a for loop. So we need to type in the word for, which is the key word to designate that this will be a for loop. Then we're going to give it an incremental variable, which in our case I will name x. And all an incremental variable, and I'll write this down, incremental variable is the variable that changes as the loop iterates. or runs. So for x, I'm going to say for x in range 10. Now if you recall from just a second ago, range 10 is going to give me a list of numbers from 0 to 9. Now what this does is that x is actually going to take on each of those values individually. So if I said print x, I need to indent this, and I hit run, now x takes on each of those values individually. And each one of these is an increment or an iteration in the loop, right? So this is an iteration. Each one of these is its own, this code block running once. So, right, x starts off at 0, it prints it. Then x increases to 1, which is the next value in the range, then prints it. Then 2, then 3. So each one of these numbers is actually an iteration of our for loop. Now, I know I just talked about for loops being a special type of while loop, so let's go ahead and take a look at what I mean by that. Now, we could define an identical while loop by just saying x equals 0, which is going to be the first value, while x is less than 10, which is going to say if x is less than 10, we're going to do something. In this case, we're going to print x, and we're also going to add 1 to x. Now, this will print out the exact same thing. Notice this is identical to this. But this is a lot more finicky, I would say. It's a little bit more of a struggle. You have to think about what the condition is. You have to start your variable, and you also have to increment your variable by hand. Whereas with this, all we need to do is define the range, and we're just going to say x is going to be that range, which makes this a lot more flexible. So for loops are really useful when we know the number of iterations we need. Whereas a while loop might be more useful if we didn't know the number of iterations and we were trying to see while x is less than 10, print if x modulus 2 equals 0. That means that this would be odd. Print, maybe we're going to say print odd. Or even, sorry. So now this is going to do something else. This is checking another condition. Even, which isn't really useful code, but we're checking in here a condition, right? So this is more useful when we don't necessarily know the number of iterations in this case. And it would be more useful if we were changing this condition, right? So that's an example where we might want to use a while loop. But let's go ahead and take a look at the flowchart for our for loop here. So this is our flowchart here. So it starts and it asks, is x in range 10? If that is true, it prints x, and then x becomes the next value in the range 10. So if I were doing, I'm going to say iterations, and I'm going to abbreviate, and then I'm going to say x. So x is our incremental variable. So inc variable, I'm abbreviating. Now in the first iteration, x is going to be the first value in range 10. So it's going to be 0, because range 10 starts on 0. Then in the second iteration, it's going to be x will be 1, because we would become the next value in the range, then so on. So we'd go all the way down to iteration 10, where x is not 10, but is 9, because range 10 only includes up until 9. So that's how our for loop works. It's pretty straightforward. But let's go ahead and take a look at another interesting example, more interesting than just printing out single-digit numbers, which is kind of boring. Okay, so what you're looking at here is just a little piece of code that I wrote that uses a for loop in a kind of fun way. So this code is just going to ask for an input for the highest number in the range and gives a sum of all the integers in that range. So the first thing I do is ask for the input. I'm asking for the highest number in the range that the user wants. Then I'm going to declare a variable called total, which is going to start at 0, and this is a variable that I'm going to track the sum of the integers with. So this total is going to change as number changes inside of my for loop here. So if we look at my for loop declaration, I have my number is my incremental variable or my iterator, and then notice I said in range upper plus 1. Now if you recall, if I just put in range upper here, range upper would not be included. So this would not be the highest number in the range. This would be the highest number in the range minus 1. So I need to say plus 1, because that will then include whatever the user inputted here. Then on the inside of the code block, what I said is that total equals total plus number. Now that kind of seems like it's weird because I have total here and I have total here and I'm like redefining it. But think of it this way. This total is the old value of total. So this is the value of the previous increment. And we are redefining the new total on the left side to be the old total plus whatever number is at that time. So if we went ahead and started the for loop, we would see that total starts at 0. Number also starts at 0 because the first number in range is 0. So total would still be 0. So this is still 0. Then number increases to 1 as we go to the next iteration. So now number is 1. And then that adds to the old total, which is 0. And now the new total is 1. Then number increases to 2. And we go ahead and add that to the total from the previous iteration, which is now 1. Add 2 to it, and we get a new total of 3. Then as number increases to 3, we go ahead and get number, which is 3, plus the old total from the previous increment, which is 3, and then we get total equals 6. So if we get, let's go ahead and try that. So if I said enter highest number in the range equals 3, I get 6, which is perfect. That's exactly what I just defined. So now if we go over that again, let's do an even smaller example. Let's just say 2. So this should add up 0, 1, and 2. If we think about it, right, so number is going to start off at 0. We're going to get total plus, so total is 0 plus number, which is 0, we get 0. Then number increases to 1, so we're going to get 0 plus 1, so now total is 1. Then when number increases to 2, then we get 1 plus 2, which is 3. So we finally get that total. And then at the end, we just print it out. So this is kind of a cool code, actually. It works for really any number that I enter. If I enter in 100, I actually get 5050, which is the total for all numbers from 0 to 100, which is pretty cool, actually. So this is a nice little piece of code. And notice, I don't necessarily know what this the range will be, but it is an input, so it will be defined. And that's the key to a for loop. If you can define the number of iterations, then you will use a for loop. Whereas if you can't really define how many iterations you need, you would use a while loop. So that's the power of a for loop. So let's go ahead and summarize what we talked about today. So, for loops are iterative loops that run a defined number of iterations. And that was what I was just talking about. We need to define how many iterations we need. The range function generates a list of numbers based on the arguments given. So remember, there's 1 argument, 2 arguments, and 3 arguments. There's the first argument, it would just be the stop. 2 arguments would be start, stop. And then 3 arguments would be start, stop, step, which is kind of an easy way to remember that. Another point is that for loops are useful when we know the exact number of times we want our loop to run, whereas while loops are useful when the number of iterations is unknown, or we want a condition on the inside of the loop to determine when the loop ends. So that's when kind of for loops versus while loops. For loops are more simple, but they're less flexible, so we can't use them in every situation. So make sure you know what kind of loop you need. Determine if you can figure out how many iterations there are, and if you can't, probably just use a while loop. But anyways, happy programming.